Well, it's great to welcome you back as we are continuing our studies of New Testament Greek. We're coming this morning to chapter 13 of the Machen text, so if you've been following along, then you're ready for this chapter. This chapter introduces for us now a new tense of the Greek verb. We've looked at the present tense. We've looked at the imperfect tense, which is actually in the Greek frame of mind pretty closely related to the present tense. Now we move to really a new tense. This is the future tense in which we begin discussing action that's taking place, of course, sometime in the future. Every language has some idea of a future tense, and Greek is no exception to that rule. The formation of the future tense of the Greek verb is really pretty easy in terms of the basic idea, although it gets a little bit more complex, as we'll see as we go along. But basically, all you have to do to form the future of the verb is simply insert the letter sigma. So you know the verb luo means I loose or I destroy. If you insert a sigma in there so it becomes luso, then at that point the verb means I will loose or I will destroy. And that's really all there is to it. The endings remain the same, so it's luso, luces, luce, lusomen, lucete, lususi in the active, and then in the middle, lusomai, luce, lucetai, lusometha, lucesta, lusontai. So you recognize those endings. Those are nothing new, and the sigma is really the only new little adjustment that we make. Well, if that were all there were to it, of course it would be a very easy lesson, but there are a few other little complications that come along, so we need to make note of the basic way in which the future is formed, but then we also may need to pay attention to some other little details. The first of which is this. Sometimes the stem of the verb ends with a consonant. And so if it ends with a consonant, for example, let's say we have the word blepo. Well, you know the stem there is blep. And pi is not a vowel, and so if I were to take the sigma and put it right there next to the pi, then I'm going to have pi sigma. And while we could pronounce it that way, as it turns out, the Greek alphabet actually has a letter that creates that pi sigma sound, the letter psi. And so what takes place in the future is that the pi sigma is replaced by the psi character, so it becomes blepso, using the psi. And there's certain rules governing how the sigma is going to be attached to a preceding consonant that need to be addressed. So I'm going to look at those with you in just a moment, but just a heads up, that's one little item that we need to be aware of. The other, which is somewhat more profound, and this is really the first occasion we've had to introduce this, so I'll try to explain it, and then we'll be referring back to it as we go along here. And that has to do with what are called the principal parts of the Greek verb. The principal parts really have to do with various ways in which there will be changes to the verb stem depending on what tense we're using. There are 6 principal parts in Greek, and the 6 principal parts are, first of all, the present system, and that's what we've looked at so far. So the present tense and the imperfect tense are both considered part of the present system, because basically the verb stem doesn't change. You noticed in both cases the word luo, the stem there, remained the same. The second of the principal parts is what's called the future system, and that's what we're coming to in this chapter, and that's why I'm taking the time to talk about this right now. The reason it's considered a separate system is because there is an actual change in the stem. Now the stem, in the case of luo, changes rather modestly. We simply add the sigma, and there we have it, you know. Or if the stem ends in a consonant, then we add the sigma and we change the consonant slightly, and there we have it. But sometimes you'll find that in certain cases the verb stem changes somewhat more strikingly or unexpectedly, and it gives rise to a class of verbs that are somewhat irregular in the way that they form the stem in the future system and in the other systems as well. Some of the more important of these will be mentioned by Machen in the vocabulary list, and we'll certainly refer to them as we go along and try to emphasize them. But you should be aware of the fact that you cannot necessarily predict what the change in the stem will be when you go from one system to the other. So right now we only need to worry about the first two of these. If you're curious, the other systems that we'll run into, the third one is called the aorist system, and we'll come to that pretty soon in an upcoming chapter. And then we have what's called the perfect system. That's the fourth of them. The fifth is the perfect passive system, and the sixth is the aorist passive system. So that's all of them. As I say, don't worry about that right now. Don't panic, but just keep in mind that right now all we need to deal with is just the first two of these so-called systems, and we'll be assuming that as we go along. And of course, as we encounter new chapters and need to add new ideas, then we'll take care of that in the process as well. Machen makes the point that you may want to become conversant with the paradigms that are provided at the end of the book, and especially the glossary, which does give you, in the case of the verbs, the other systems that are available. And you might even want to take a look at the back of the book right now and just notice, if you look up various verbs, how you'll find the verb listed separated by a comma, various forms of it, and each one of those represents one of the expressions of that verb in one of the various systems that you're going to find as we go along. So I hope that makes sense. I'll be alluding back to this as we proceed, and as I say right now, you don't need to be too concerned about it, but simply be aware of the fact that we do have these so-called systems, and they will be part of our conversation as we proceed to deal with the Greek language and the Greek verbs in particular. What I'd like to do now is take a few minutes to go through the actual vocabulary list and talk a little bit more about how these sigmas are added to consonants, and then we'll take a look at some exercises, and I'll turn you loose to go through the rest of the exercises, and hopefully that will all be straightforward for you. So let's look at the vocabulary list. The first of our vocabulary words is the word anablepo. Ana, you'll notice, is a preposition. It's evidently a prefix here to the word. So ana, which generally means up, and some such thing. We've already had blepo, which was from our first vocabulary list, means I see. And so, in a literal sense, we would say that this means I see up. It actually is translated, I look up, but it also idiomatically means in Greek, I receive my sight. And so, as you can imagine, in the New Testament, when we find there is this notion of a blind person receiving their sight, this is the verb that's being used. Notice that Machen now goes ahead and gives us the second of the principal parts. If he were complete, he would give us 3, 4, 5, and 6 all the way over here, but right now, since we're only getting to the future system, this is all we're going to worry about. What we notice is that, just as I was saying to you earlier, the blep is the stem ends with a pi. If I were to take a pi and add a sigma to it, then it gives us essentially the letter psi, and that's what we have here. So the future becomes anablepso, I will receive my sight. And he's simply giving this to you to illustrate how that works. And so we'll say a little bit more about that as we go along, but nevertheless, I think you see from here the basic mechanics of how we accomplish that. The next of these vocabulary words is the word basomai, basomai. It is actually the future of the Greek verb bino. We've already looked at bino. It's a word that means I go. What you want to notice here is that even though bino, I go, in the present system is not deponent, when we shift to the future system, it becomes basomai. The sigma tells us it's the future, and the omai tells us that it's a deponent verb, because it means I shall go, and yet, as you can tell, I shall go is an active idea. Nevertheless, it has a middle, or in this case, a middle ending. So basomai is called a deponent future. And you're going to find occasionally that that's what we encounter, is that certain verbs are regular in one system, but deponent in another. And that's especially true with respect to the future. In a similar kind of way, we have genesomai. We've already had the verb genomai, which means I become. takes the nominative, of course, the predicate nominative, was deponent, you recall, and not surprisingly, when we get to the future, we find that it's also deponent. What you want to notice here is that we wouldn't necessarily guess how to form the future. Genesomai is not necessarily what we would have anticipated from genomai. We have an epsilon there where there would have been an iota, and so on. And the transformation of into this eta, it may be unexpected. So again, this is one of those situations where we notice that as we move from one system to another, the formation of the stem can be somewhat irregular. And so really the only solution to that is simply to memorize it, but then language, as you know, is 100% memorization, so that shouldn't come as a big surprise. Another irregular verb, we've had gnosko, you know, in the present, I know. In the future, it's gnosomai. And notice once again, it's deponent in the future, though it's not deponent in the present. Notice also that the iota that we did have right between the gamma and the nu is gone, and now it sort of becomes just gnosomai, so it's just one syllable there in the stem. And that's the deponent future of the word I know. It means I will know. Didagzo is the future of a word we've had, didasco. This again is formed somewhat irregularly. You can imagine it would be difficult to add a sigma to the didasco. We already have a sigma chi, and then another sigma there would make it quite difficult to pronounce, and so the Greeks simply incorporated a gazi, and the way the stem is formed is didagzo. We have the word here dioko. Dioko means I pursue or I persecute. I don't know of any English derivatives from that, but you want to notice that the future, not surprisingly in this case, is diogzo, formed by really adding a sigma to the kappa there, and if you do that you get the sound that is more or less represented by that letter. Doxadzo, I glorify. We already had doxa, so that's a word that's related. The future here, doxasso. Notice that the zeta is simply replaced by a sigma. And so we don't try to add a sigma to it. I don't know what that would produce, but it simply becomes doxasso. I will glorify. Illusomai, deponent, future of erchomai. So erchomai means I come or I go, and of course in the future it simply means I will come or I will go. The future of echo is hexo. Notice the rough breather there, and again we have a gazi where there would have been the chi, and so that gives us the future I shall have. Next we have keruso. Keruso means I preach. You may know the word used sometimes in theology, kerygma or karugma. This is a word that means the central gospel of the New Testament, and it comes actually from this verb keruso, I preach. The future is formed by replacing the double sigma there with a gazi, so it becomes kerugzo, I will preach. Lampsomai is the deponent future of lambano. We've already had lambano, of course, I take or I receive. The future deponent, notice, is lampsomai, I will take or I will receive. Next is prosukomai. This means I pray, and the future is prosugzomai. So again, we just put the gazi there where we did have a chi, and that becomes the future I shall pray. And then finally, taflos. Taflos means a blind man, masculine, and regular throughout, so that's just an additional vocabulary word, noun, that we'll have added in this particular vocabulary list. Just wanted to take a minute to show you the formation of luo. I indicated to you earlier that the verb is formed in a quite regular fashion, and you can see it here. We have the verb luo, lues, lue. To form the future, all we do is throw a sigma in between the stem and the ending. And so this is quite regular and actually quite predictable. And if all Greek verbs were this easy, we wouldn't have to worry so much about the future. It doesn't always turn out to be quite as neat as this, but in this case it's at least illustrative. of the principle. Luso, luces, luce, lusomen, lucita, lususi is in each case an indication throughout the conjugation of the future. The middle, lusomai, luce, lucitai, lusometha, lucesta, lusontai, indicating the middle voice, which, as we indicated earlier, is usually of interest to us more in the case of deponent verbs, but we need to learn it either way. And again, you'll notice that simply adding the sigma is what's necessary to form the future stem. So in that case, of course, it's quite straightforward, and that's the basic principle. That's the main thing you want to be aware of, but also keep in mind that not every verb forms the future stem quite so predictably. And in that case, really the only way to know for sure is to look at the vocabulary list toward the end of the book and find out exactly how that stem is formed. And then once it's formed, you'll find the endings are quite predictable, quite regular. The tricky part is simply knowing the stem and how it's formed in each of the principal parts, the most important of which for our purposes right now is, of course, the second of the principal parts, the future system. Now you notice down here at the bottom of the page at paragraph 156, Machen introduces a topic that's pretty important, and I just want to walk through this a little bit with you at this point myself. He says, when the stem of a verb ends in a consonant. We already talked about that situation earlier, but here he gives some further explanation. When the stem ends in a consonant, the addition of the suffix sigma will bring these two consonants together. And when that happens, it can result in various effects. The first of them typically involves what are called labial mutes. These are the letters pi, beta, and phi. They're called labial because they are pronounced by means of the labia, or the lips. It's the old Latin term for that. And in that case, when you have a labial mute, the sigma that's added to it is going to result in the letter psi. We've talked about this before, but just to illustrate, he gives the future of pimpo becomes pimpso, you see. Of grapho becomes grapso. So we have a letter in the Greek alphabet that accommodates those combinations of a labial mute with the sigma, and that's what typically will happen. Again, this is a general rule. There are exceptions, but at least for learning purposes, this is what you want to get a hold of. We also have what are called palatal mutes. These are formed using the palate, hence that term. These would be kappa, gamma, and chi. You notice your tongue is elevated toward the rear of your mouth and toward the palate. In other words, that's why they're given that term. When a sigma is added to a palatal mute, then the resulting letter is going to be z. And we have various examples of that. Augo, I lead, becomes augzo. Arco, I rule, becomes argzo, and so on. Finally, we have lingual mutes. These are formed with the front of the tongue, tau, delta, theta. And typically what happens here is the consonant drops out and is simply replaced by the sigma standing alone. For example, we have patho becomes peso. So that's the general rule as to how these new consonants are formed when you move to the future. But he also continues by pointing out that sometimes it's not quite so predictable. So for example, at 157 he says, in the case of many verbs, the verb stem is different from the present stem. And this is what we were discussing in connection with the so-called principal parts. So for example, if we have the word keruso, the verb stem is actually not kerus, which we might have expected, but in the Old Greek it's keruk. And so we use keruk to form the future, and it becomes kerugzo. You wouldn't know that by intuition. You'd have to actually have studied that. But the point is, as you learn these particular words as you go along, you'll kind of learn these forms as well. So the reason he's introducing this is simply to prevent any confusion when you encounter words that don't seem to follow the typical script here. The verb stem of, for example, baptizo is not baptids, which we might have thought, but actually baptid with a delta. And so when we apply that lingual mute there, to the future, we find it disappears and it simply comes baptizo. That's the way that takes place. He notes at 158 that the future of the Greek verb cannot certainly be formed by any specific rules. There's no way we can just by a deductive process come up with what the stem is going to be. He says that the Greek verb tends to be very regular once we have gotten the stem, but the formation of the stem can sometimes be quite irregular. And that's why we learn about these principal parts, which are 6 in number, that we were discussing a moment ago. Also, as we were mentioning, the principal parts are 6 in number. We've only learned, of course, the first 2 of these at this point. We've learned the present system and the future system. Others are going to be added as we go along, so again, I don't want you to panic about this. Just be aware that we're going to continue talking about principal parts as we proceed. He gives an illustration here at paragraph 160 of the sense in which you can sometimes be a little bit surprised at the way in which the stem is transformed in these various principal parts. For example, we have this verb erchomai, and we might say, okay, that's the present tense and it's the present system, so what's it going to be in the future? Well, it turns out that it's going to be elusomai. Now, unless you're extraordinarily intuitive, I don't think you would have gotten from erchomai to elusomai just by guessing. That's where simply memorizing the various stems that become part of the systems of the various tenses becomes essential. So at this point, when we form the future of erchomai, we just remember that it's elusomai. But then, of course, once we have that, the endings themselves remain very predictable. So elusomai, eluse, elusatai, elusamatha, elusestha, elusantai, he gives here. Well, you already know those endings. The only thing that was really a surprise was the way in which the stem was transformed when we got to the second of the principal parts. Machen says from this point on, it'll be assumed that the student will use the general vocabularies in the back of the book, and then he gives a suggestion as to how those vocabularies should be approached. So let's go ahead and take a look here at an example, at least, from the vocabulary in the back of the book, just to see what he's illustrating in this discussion. I have now referred you back to page 256 at the back of the book of Machen, and I'd suggest that you find your way there as well in your own book as you follow along. But just to illustrate our point, I want you to notice how some of these verbs have multiple forms. So I'm just looking at random here at this particular word. This is apostello, I send. You know the word apostle. This is simply the verb form of that, apostello. Then notice comma, and then apostolo is the future. Now, I'm not going to worry you at this point about how that future was formed. I know it looks a little bit unexpected, but just notice that there is a second form. Then we have a third form here, a fourth form, a fifth form, and a sixth form. These are the 6 of the principal parts. And so for any Greek verb, though many are formed in a regular fashion, some are formed somewhat irregularly, and Machen is indicating that from this point on, it's going to be anticipated that you will go to the back of the book and take a peek if in fact you need to clarify in your own mind what the form of the stem is going to be in each of these principal parts. So those are the 6, just to remind you again, it's the future, or the present, the future, the aorist. Then we have the perfect passive, and the aorist passive. So those are the 6. You don't need to learn those yet. We're going to learn them one by one in a fairly methodical fashion as we go along, so don't panic about that. But once again, just be aware that that's what we're dealing with. He indicates in particular the treatment of the word archo. And he says that if you were going to try to form, for example, the future middle third person plural of archo, well, first of all, to get the future, you're going to go to the back of the book. Here we have archo. We see the second one is argzo. No surprise there, that's the future. And once we have that stem, the args of argzo, then we know we're going to go to the middle. So argzo is going to become argzomai, you know, because that's the middle form. And then the third person plural will be argzontai, argzontai. And so he goes through that discussion. I'd suggest you read it through, but when he refers to the back of the book, this is what he's expecting that you're going to be investigating in that process. On the other hand, the reverse of that process is based on the discussion here that we have on page 78. He says if you find the form, for example, so say, then you're going to say to yourself, that looks a little bit like sozo, except that I see the sigma, and you're going to guess that the sigma represents the future stem in the same way that we might have in the case of luso and luce. And that would in fact be the case, although you'd check in the back of the book just to be sure about that. In a similar way, if the student sees ogzo, then you're going to guess that that gz right there is concealing a sigma. And so it's probably going to be, you have to unpackage it in that direction and find out that it's going to be either ako, ago, or oxo. And of course, in this case, we know it's ago because we've had that word. So you can see you kind of reverse engineer these words a little bit as you're dealing with them. I hope this makes sense. It may seem a little bit confusing as you're first encountering it, but if you'll just simply pay attention to the discussion that's provided by Machen and think about this as you're doing the exercises, I think you'll find that after a while it becomes pretty much second nature, so that you won't find this to be overly challenging. All right, well, with that, let's take a look at our exercises. We'll deal, of course, first of all with the translation exercises, translating from Greek to English. We'll look at the first three of these. The first of them is ogze hokurios tous mathetas autou eis tein basilean. Well, of course, the first thing that catches my eye here is I've got the ogze, and unless I'd read this chapter, I might be at quite a loss as to know what's going on. But I remember, of course, we have the verb ago, and I now am going to assume that the future is being formed, and if I add a gamma plus a sigma, then by the rules we were noticing earlier, it produces a gz, and so that seems to be what's going on. Ogze, so it's going to be the future, the ending here, third person singular, ogze, so it'll mean he will lead. Looking for a subject, I find hokurios in the nominative case, so the Lord will lead tous mathetas autou, the disciples of him, his disciples, eis with the accusative, tein basilean, into the kingdom. The Lord will lead his disciples into the kingdom. The second exercise, gnosomatha kai tous agathous kai tous ponerus. Well, again, the thing that gets my attention first of all is gnosomatha. I remember, of course, that the word gnosko forms a deponent future, and it's gnosomai. This is the first person plural ending, so gnosomatha, we will know. I notice that kai and kai form this kind of couplet here, and I know that in that case it's a both and construction, so we will know both tous agathous, the good, or presumably the good men, since that's accusative masculine. We will know both the good men, kai, and tous ponerus, the evil men. We will know both the good and the evil men. And finally, looking at the third of these exercises, we have lempsistha ta ploia ek tes thalases. Lempsistha, once again, I'll remember, is from lambano. It's deponent future, lempsomai, I will take or I will receive. Estha is the ending for the second person plural, so you will take or you will receive. Then ta ploia, remember the verb or the word boats. This is neuter, plural. You will take the boats ek tes thalases, out of the sea. You will take the boats out of the sea. Shifting now to the composition exercises, going from English to Greek. The first of them that Machen provides, the church will send servants to me. The church will send servants to me. So, of course, I know the word, the church. Had that many times now, so that's easy. Hey, ecclesia, the church, will send. Well, I have the word pempo, and if I'm going to form the future, I assume that I'm going to say pempo, adding a sigma to a pi, and it's going to give me the psi. If I'm not sure, I can go back to the vocabulary or the glossary at the back of the book and check that. And on doing so, I'll find that that is correct. So the church will send. You might be wondering, what about the verb apostello? Could we form the future of that? And the answer is yes. But because it ends with a lambda, apostello, it's a form of verb that's called a liquid verb, and it forms the future in a somewhat different fashion. So whenever you see in the exercises, at least to this point, I will send in the future, we're going to be staying with this verb pempo. We know the future for this one. We don't know the future yet for apostello, so you can just restrict your application of this vocabulary to this particular word. So the church will send doulos, servants, not the servants, so there shouldn't be a definite article there. The church will send servants, pros me. Me, of course, is enclitic. You remember from the chapter on enclitics that it's common to find pros me with the non-emphatic form of the enclitic after the preposition pros. So the church will send slaves to me. And that's what your answer should look like, something like that. The second exercise we have, these women will become good. These women. We, of course, don't know the word for women. The Greek word gune means woman, but we haven't had that yet. But we can form the word, these women, using the demonstrative pronoun hutos, haute, tuto. And the feminine, haute, when we look at the nominative plural, feminine, becomes hautai. Notice we have a circumflex because the last is short and a long accented penult requires the circumflex. So hautai, genosantai, this was the deponent future of genomai, I become. In the future it's genesomai, I shall become. The third person plural ending, genesontai, these women will become. Then agathai, I could have used kalai as well, good in that sense, meaning more becoming good as in beautiful. Here, agathai means good as in morally virtuous, and I assume that's the sense that is intended by the sentence. So these women will become good. And the last of the exercises that we'll be looking at here, number 3 in Machen's set, is these words I shall write in a book. These words I shall write in a book. So I start off with these words. Notice that it's a direct object, so it's going to be in the accusative case. I shall write these words, so it's going to be tutus, tus, logus. These, the words. Gropso, of course we've had grapho, which is I write. The future is gropso, again putting the psi in there. I shall write, these words I shall write, in, no definite article, in a biblio, book, takes the dative case, because in takes the dative, and so I shall write these words in a book. You'll see these are fairly straightforward, and I think with that much assistance you can probably work your way through the rest of the exercises. Once again, I've provided the answer key to you, and I hope that as you are able to take up the work on the rest of the exercises and compare your work with the answer key, that you'll be able to make good sense out of the way in which this vocabulary list and the formation of the future tense can be achieved. This particular chapter is a little bit more difficult than some others we've looked at, mainly because we are introducing now the second of the principal parts, and we are introducing the idea that sometimes the verb stem will change, and sometimes it can change in ways that are not overly predictable. The bottom line is, in situations like that, you just need to apply your mind to memorizing them, and pretty soon it'll become more or less second nature. Although at the beginning it can seem a little bit daunting, but I think you'll be able to work your way through it. I hope we've been able to explain this adequately enough. And when you're all set and when you've done the exercises and feel comfortable with this chapter, then feel free to come on back and we'll proceed to chapter 14. And until then, God's richest blessings on you.